They say the most dangerous weapon in the world is a man with nothing to lose and something to believe in. This young Muslim hacker wasn't out for fame or chaos. He didn't strike for clout or to leave his name burned into headlines. He struck because his conscience told him to. Because he saw something that didn't sit right in his spirit, and in the silence of his room, behind a glowing screen, he chose to act. He wasn't some villain in the shadows. He was a student, a son, a believer, raised on faith, justice, and the belief that even a single voice, or in this case a single line of code, could call attention to something the world kept looking away from. He didn't come with bombs. He didn't pick up a gun. He picked up a keyboard, and with every keystroke he was writing a protest. Not in ink, but in logic and algorithms and digital courage. And yet, the moment the Israeli server fell, the world didn't ask why. They didn't stop to ask what drove him to this digital battlefield. No, they labeled him in bold letters: hacker, terrorist, threat. But what if, just what if, he wasn't any of those things? What if he was a mirror, showing us what we've become when people are forced to shout through firewalls just to be heard? The truth is, this story isn't about a server going offline. It's about a system that's been offline from morality for too long. This wasn't about destruction. It was about exposure. The server he took down wasn't just digital space. It was symbolic. A platform used for surveillance, coordination, or control. It represented something bigger, and when it fell, even for a moment, the world had to look at what it stood for. That was his intention. To disrupt not for chaos, but for conversation. And when it happened, the reaction was swift and telling. International media spun it instantly. Cyberattack by extremists. Politicians called for crackdowns. Security agencies launched manhunts. But behind all the noise, one undeniable truth echoed louder. He made people pay attention. People who had ignored war, ignored occupation, ignored suffering, they suddenly cared about a server. And in that irony lies the shock of what happened next. Instead of hearing the message, they came for the messenger. They tracked him, isolated him, silenced him. Because power doesn't fear violence, it fears exposure. It fears someone pulling back the curtain. And when that curtain dropped, it wasn't the hacker they feared. It was the uncomfortable questions that came with him. Why did he do it? What was he pointing to? And why do we listen to servers but not to screams? Some call him a criminal, others a hero. But strip away the headlines, the heat, and the politics, and you find a man, not perfect, not without flaws, but driven by something many of us have forgotten: a code. Not the kind that breaks systems, but the kind that builds character. A code of faith, of accountability, of speaking truth, even if your voice shakes or even if your voice is made of ones and zeros. So whether you agree with his method or not, remember this: when the powerful stop listening to peaceful voices, the desperate speak louder. Sometimes with protests, sometimes with keyboards, but always with conviction. And conviction, real, raw, unshaken conviction, that's something you can't silence with a server reset. Because in the end, this wasn't just a hack. It was a cry for dignity, a cry the world couldn't ignore. Faith is a powerful thing. It doesn't come wrapped in politics or borders. It doesn't speak the language of the news cycle. It lives in the quiet corners of our decisions and the reasons we stand when it would be easier to stay seated. This young Muslim hacker, the one the world is still trying to define with headlines, was not just reacting, he was responding. Responding to injustice, responding to oppression, but most of all, responding to a deep-rooted sense of right and wrong born from his faith. The media wanted to reduce him to a single label, but the truth is, this story started long before the server fell. It started in his beliefs, his upbringing, his understanding that Islam isn't about destruction, it's about discipline, dignity, and defending the oppressed. He didn't wake up that morning and choose to be controversial. He woke up and remembered the images, the sounds, the names, children without homes, families torn apart. A silence that echoed louder than any explosion. And somewhere deep inside, his faith wouldn't let him sit still. So when he typed that first command, when he breached that first wall, it wasn't ego or vengeance guiding him. It was conviction. It was the kind of belief that whispers to your soul, if not you, then who? And for all the chaos that followed, he never doubted why he did it. But here's where the world got it twisted. The hack, bold as it was, wasn't the real shock. It wasn't the act that shook the ground. It was what happened after, the reaction, the panic, the desperate attempts to control the narrative. Suddenly, a digital action became a global incident. Countries pointed fingers, intelligence agencies launched full-scale investigations. People who had been silent about human suffering were now loud, loud about a broken server, loud about cybercrime, loud about punishment. And that says something, doesn't it? It says the world doesn't react to pain until that pain touches power, until it affects their infrastructure, until the uncomfortable truths become impossible to ignore. He didn't take lives, he didn't detonate anything, but somehow, his quiet strike in the digital dark echoed louder than the thousands of unheard cries in the daylight. That was the shock. That's what shook the system. Not the hack, but the reminder that sometimes one act of disruption speaks more than 1,000 unanswered pleas. And still, instead of listening, they hunted him. They dragged his faith into question. They branded him a threat, a radical, a criminal. But let me ask you, since when did questioning injustice make you a criminal? Since when did standing up or typing up for the voiceless become a crime? The shock isn't that the server went down. The shock is that it took a server going down for the world to look up and pay attention. Because behind the firewalls and headlines is a man driven by faith. Not fanaticism, but firm belief. A belief that being Muslim means standing with the oppressed, not staying silent. That even when the world closes its eyes, his God sees. And maybe, just maybe, that belief gave him the strength to do what no one else dared. To reach across a digital line and say, enough. That kind of faith doesn't need validation. It walks alone if it must. But it leaves a trail the world can't ignore. The world loves to talk about strength. Strength in numbers, strength in weapons, strength in money and control. But history, real history, has always been shaped by something else. The strength of one sharp mind guided by purpose. And that's what this Muslim hacker brought to the table. He wasn't the most powerful man in the world, not by any political standard. He didn't lead armies. He didn't hold office, and he didn't have a nation backing him. But what he did have was strategy, focus, discipline, and above all, he had a reason. He didn't charge in like a wrecking ball. No. He studied, he planned, he understood every digital wall he was about to breach. This was not the act of a reckless rebel. This was precision, intelligence, a mind sharpened by injustice and trained by silence. Like David facing Goliath, he didn't need brute strength. He needed clarity. And that's what made the world uneasy. He didn't stumble into that Israeli server by luck. He aimed for it. And when it fell, it wasn't just a collapse in cyberspace. It was a signal, one that said, I see you, and I know how to reach you. The digital world has become today's battlefield. We fight wars with drones, with leaks, with code, and this young man didn't bring destruction for the sake of destruction. He brought exposure. A calculated, targeted action meant to shake the illusion of untouchability. He chose his target not for chaos, but for consequence. That's the part that rattled the powerful. Because you expect chaos from the desperate. What you don't expect is control. Calm, focused defiance. The kind that says, I'm not here to burn the house down. I'm here to show you the cracks in the foundation. And when that moment came, when the breach was done and the server dropped, the shockwave wasn't just technical. It was psychological. They didn't just lose data. They lost confidence. For a moment, the mask slipped. The system that had always seemed untouchable had been touched by one man with no army, no resources, no flag, just his mind and his mission. And that's what shook the world more than anything else. That's what sparked the fury, the fear, the fallout. Because people in power fear one thing more than rebellion, exposure. They fear the idea that someone might show the world what they've been hiding. And that's exactly what this act did. It didn't just challenge a server. It challenged a narrative. It said, you are not invisible. You are not immune. And someone out here is watching you, not with hate, but with clarity. That's a different kind of threat. Not one that wants to destroy, but one that demands accountability. It's easy to dismiss a hacker as a criminal, as a troublemaker, as someone who just wants to disrupt. But it takes a deeper look to see what he really was, a symbol of intelligence used for disruption with a deeper message. He proved that one person, when driven by purpose and faith, could do more with a keyboard than an army could with missiles. That's what makes this story different. That's what makes it resonate. He wasn't just smart, he was precise. And that kind of precision, guided by belief instead of greed or ego, that's what makes Goliath fall. And maybe that's the real threat he posed. Not in what he broke, but in what he revealed. The moment the server went down, the world didn't ask. What pushed him to this point? They didn't ask what he saw, what he endured, or what voices he was echoing when he struck. Instead, they panicked. And the panic wasn't because of the damage done. It was because of what the hack exposed. You see, the real shock wasn't the action itself. It was the global reaction. The way power responded when someone pulled back the curtain and said, "Look, governments issued emergency statements. News outlets rolled out breaking coverage. Security agencies scrambled to patch digital wounds." For a moment, the system that seemed invincible started trembling. Not from the breach, but from the truth behind it. When someone who's unheard finds a way to make the world listen, it terrifies those who've spent years covering their ears. That's what happened here. This wasn't just a cyber attack. It was a spotlight. A sharp beam aimed directly at silence, at complicity, at the comfortable lies we tell ourselves when injustice happens far from our door. Suddenly, those who had ignored years of suffering began to talk about security threats. Politicians who stayed quiet during real-world violence were now outraged over digital disruption. Think about that. The world turned its head from war, from bombed homes, from dying children. But a server went dark, and now they wanted justice. That contradiction, that selective outrage, is the real shock of this story. And the young man who caused it knew exactly what he was doing. His intention wasn't to terrify. It was to testify, to make the powerful feel even a fraction of the fear and instability they've allowed others to live with for years. In that sense, the reaction he provoked was the loudest admission of guilt you could ask for. Because when the system reacted not with understanding but with attack, not with introspection but with accusations, it told the world exactly what it values and what it doesn't. He wasn't surprised by the backlash. He expected it. When you shine light into places designed to stay in the dark, the first thing that fights back is the shadow. The machine doesn't just protect itself. It denies the reason it exists. That's what makes this story so powerful. The hack wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. He showed the world how fragile control really is when it's built on silence and fear. And when that control cracked, the people who once called themselves the protectors of order became the loudest defenders of the broken system he exposed. What they couldn't see, or refused to see, was that he wasn't acting from hate. He was acting from hurt, from a place of deep conviction, a place the world rarely recognizes unless it comes in the form of approved protests or sanitized speeches. But conviction doesn't always show up in ways the world expects. Sometimes it types instead of speaks. Sometimes it hacks instead of marches. And when it does, it forces us to confront not just the act, but the world that made it necessary. That's why the reaction was so loud. That's why the headlines screamed and the agencies moved with urgency. Not because a machine went offline, but because a man stood up. Because in that moment, he didn't just break a system. He broke the illusion that the system is untouchable. And that's what scared them most. Every action has a cost. Every choice comes with a weight. And when this young Muslim hacker decided to press that final command, to execute the code that would take down a powerful Israeli server, he knew the price wouldn't be cheap. He wasn't naive. He wasn't living in a fantasy where truth triumphs overnight and the world applauds courage. He knew what would follow: the search, the surveillance, the smear campaigns. He knew the system wouldn't just come for his freedom. It would come for his identity, his beliefs, his future. But he did it anyway, and that's what makes his story not just controversial, but deeply human. Because when you act with honor, when you act from a place of truth, that doesn't mean the world will treat you kindly. In fact, it often means the opposite. The system will try to silence you, shame you, erase you. It won't attack just your actions. It'll attack your motives, your faith, your very character. That's what happened here. This wasn't just a digital manhunt. It was an attempt to turn a man into a monster. To strip away the context, the emotion, the reason behind his actions and replace it with fear. He didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because he knew the machine he'd challenged wouldn't allow a fair fight. He knew that once the world labeled him hacker, threat, or terrorist, there would be no space for the truth, no courtroom that would see the full picture. And so he disappeared, not into hiding, but into exile. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something many don't. That when you speak truth to power, power rarely answers with understanding. It answers with punishment. But even in exile, even in silence, his presence lingered. He had already left a mark that couldn't be undone. And that's something systems of control never know how to handle. A message that continues to spread even when the messenger is gone. His act, while brief in execution, became permanent in impact. People began asking questions, debating, wondering. The very conversation he had tried to start was now happening on global platforms, in policy rooms, on university campuses. and all of it came with a cost he willingly paid. That's the part the world doesn't see. The price of a pulse, the toll of being human in a world that treats you like a symbol. He wasn't some faceless programmer hiding in the dark. He was someone's son, someone's brother, a believer who prayed with the same hands he used to type his protest. And when the system came for him, it didn't care about any of that. It didn't care about what pushed him to this point. It only cared about the fallout, the embarrassment, the exposure. But he accepted that. Because when your fight is rooted in truth, you don't fight to win. You fight because not fighting is no longer an option. He knew he might not see the end of the story, that his name might vanish while the debate continues. But sometimes that's what real courage looks like, knowing you'll pay the price and doing it anyway. He bled in silence so others might speak freely. He lost his voice so the truth could echo louder. When the smoke cleared and the digital dust settled, what remained wasn't just a collapsed server or a disrupted network. What remained was a question, a loud, uncomfortable question the world couldn't ignore anymore. What exactly are we protecting, and at what cost? See, this wasn't just about a cyber attack. This wasn't just about a lone hacker who struck out against a system. No, what really shook the ground was the truth that his actions forced to the surface, truths that had been buried beneath politics, media bias, and global indifference for far too long. And that's the heart of it, Revelation. That was the aftermath nobody could have predicted. It's one thing to break into a server. It's another thing to reveal what that server was hiding, what it was built to do, who it was targeting. And when those facts started leaking, when the hidden mechanisms of surveillance and control were exposed, that's when the real panic began. Not because people feared the hacker. They feared what the world would think if it saw the truth. This young man didn't just take down a piece of technology. He pulled the curtain back on a system that thrived in silence. And in doing so, he changed the conversation. Suddenly, the question wasn't how could he do this? It became why did it take this for the world to notice? For years, the suffering on the ground had been brushed aside as statistics. Families displaced, children orphaned, lives crushed under the weight of silence. But when that server dropped, when those files and connections came into the light, people had to look. They had to face the ugly mechanisms that operated without oversight. And for once, the world couldn't look away. That's what made this moment historic, not the breach, but the clarity. In a world addicted to comfort and distraction, this one act cut through the noise. It wasn't delivered in a speech. It wasn't sanctioned by government. It didn't wait for permission. It was raw, unapologetic, and deeply human. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come dressed in diplomacy. Sometimes it comes crashing through a firewall, leaving behind a trail of uncomfortable questions that no one wants to answer. And make no mistake, those questions started to ripple. They reached journalists who had been too cautious, activists who had lost hope, communities that had felt invisible. The narrative was no longer controlled by officials or PR campaigns. It was now in the hands of the people, and the people were angry, awake, engaged. The impact spread far beyond what he could have imagined. Forums erupted in debate. Human rights organizations were forced to respond. And suddenly, conversations that had once been whispered in corners were shouted from rooftops. What's powerful about this isn't just the reach, it's the timing. In a world that often waits too long to care, this act forced urgency. It broke the illusion that time would fix things on its own. And even though he paid a price, even though he was labeled and hunted and cast aside, the truth he revealed refused to be buried again. It kept rising, kept burning in the minds of those who finally saw what had been hidden in plain sight. Because that's what real change looks like. It's messy. It's disruptive. And it almost always starts with someone the world didn't expect. A single mind, a single act, a single truth spoken in the only language the powerful seem to hear. Exposure. And once the truth is out, there's no taking it back.